Good morning, everybody. My name is Robin Smith from the Joint Research Centre's Digital Economy Unit. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. By way of introduction, I'd like to mention that now for a couple of years, the JRC has had digital transformation as a key element of its research strategy. And actually, quite a substantial report will soon be published exploring topics such as digital transformation in the fields of construction, transportation, energy, but as well digital transformation in government. And we also have other projects similarly that are exploring the impact of ICT and digital transformation on society. Within the context of ELISE and our wider work here in the Digital Economy Unit on digital government, we also have work led by my colleague Gianluca, who has been looking very much into the research and real practical context of this topic, with a project exploring digital government transformation in the EU, looking at public sector innovation and also issues around a data-driven society. And in fact, we recently had a meeting with the ISA² Programme's Geospatial Solutions Working Group to discuss progress in that work, especially in terms of how it will help to elaborate frameworks and recommendations for policy around this topic. So clearly there's a lot of work that's going on here that needs to be contextualized. And I think basically to start things here, it's worth mentioning that this webinar is possibly something of a misnomer, as indeed it is not a rapid study in itself, but rather presents mainly the results of another much more extensive and deep study that the colleagues have been performing, with the work mainly led by my colleague Vanda around the title of this webinar, where we are very much interested in how specifically spatial data infrastructures like Inspire already been contributing to some elements of this transformative turn in government. And we'll soon share a full report on this work. And those who are attending this webinar will notify you when this report will be made available. So for this time in our webinar series of rapid studies, we'd actually like to use the work you'll hear today as a starting point towards, let's say, a follow-on rapid study by sharing with you the outcomes that we have already uncovered, but also to discuss with you some directions to explore as a follow-up as part of a rapid study, allowing us to further explore the role that geospatial can play in the digital transformation of government. So without me saying much more, because I really want to give the floor to our colleagues to share with you the work they've been doing with Vanda, I hand over now to Martina and Glenn. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robin. I don't know if everybody hears me well. I hope so. My name is Martina, and together with Glenn, I will be presenting this webinar today. I will just say a few words about me and then leave the floor to Glenn for introducing himself, just for you to know who are the people that are behind this study. So my name is Martina Barbero. I'm a senior consultant at Deloitte, working on new policy strategies. And I've been working mainly on projects related to the data economy and data for the public sector, and especially in the context of digital government transformation. So, Glenn, I don't know if you want to take the floor briefly.
Yes, all of you, just a few words about myself. I'm Glenn McComberg. I'm a research manager at the Spatial Application Division of the University of Leuven in Belgium. I worked on the study not alone from our side, KU Leuven, but I worked together with Danny van den Broeke, same unit at University of Leuven. In fact, the first time we've been doing quite a lot of studies in Europe, but also in Flanders on SDIs and many topics related to SDIs. The first time I worked together in a study with Danny was in my PhD, where we focused only on Flanders and how the SDI at that time was developed, in which I focused on coordination and governance issues. But then afterwards, we worked together in many related similar projects and studies on SDIs in Europe. A lot of them comparative studies of member states and how we are doing identification of best practices. So just an example I mentioned here is Spire EULF, and now in ELISE, we're also ELISE and EO4Geo. We're doing some work mainly on identifying skills related to SDIs and improving the uptake of spatial data and services. But then now I will take care of the second part of the presentation, and the first part of it will be presented by Martina.
Thank you very much, Glenn. So I will briefly walk you through the agenda for today. So what we will do first will be giving you a short introduction to the study and the background from theoretical perspective, but also in terms of the objectives of what we tried to achieve, the analytical framework that we developed, and the methodology and limitation of the methodologies that we adopted for carrying out this study. And then we will walk you through the main finding of the studies that will be structured around the main parts of the analytical frameworks, which are institutional setting, technical infrastructure, and impact, as we will see. Before finally going to the conclusion, which tries to summarize about the key learnings of this process, and then also launching a debate with a few questions for future work in this area. So at that point, we will really hope for some input from your side on what we did so far and how we can bring it forward. I have to mention something important here. So the final study report for this work that we are presenting today is not yet available. It's currently under publication. It will be published soon, but as far as we're concerned, the opinion expressed in this presentation and in the report are the one of the authors, of course. Although we are working for the joint research centers, and for sure we are taking into account the feedback and working hands in hands, but we take ownership of what we say here. And of course, if you have comments or any criticism in regards to what we are presenting, feel free to let us know, and we look for feedback. So you will have time at the end to let us know what you think about what we did. Without further delay, let's jump into the topic. So why there was a need to study the role of spatial data infrastructure in digital government transformation. But for a long time, the e-government and spatial data infrastructure concepts were really conceived and tackled quite as a separate matter. But more and more we see, and I think that's quite common sense, that spatial data infrastructure and digital government transformation are becoming closer in terms of how these subjects are treated, and there is some work around in terms of exploring how these concepts are related. We try to be part of this exploration, mainly because more and more we hear that SDIs can be either a building block of the wider concept of digital government transformation, or in any case part of this encompassing phenomenon. So when we look at the concepts themselves, we see that digital government transformation is in itself a concept that is broader than the pure e-government, that is quite well known, because it includes many different elements, which are not only linked to the digitalization of services for the public sector, but also to other way of working, innovative business model within the public sectors, fostering of ecosystem and interaction with stakeholders. So digital government digital transformation is a broader concept, and within these broader concepts, there are people that are trying to understand what is the role of SDI and how SDI and government digital transformation relate to each other. One of those people is Luzmore, who considers, for instance, the SDIs as a building block of his vision of government as a platform. In general, we're not here to give a final answer to the question of how SDI and digital government transformation relate, but we hope that this work will shed some light on what are the evidence at the level of European countries that can enlighten us about this relation. And we also hope that it's important to start discussing this topic even more, making the link and making the bridge between SDI and digital government transformation. So we hope that from this work, stem other work that looks into this relationship even closer. In this context and given this background, we had the objective of this study was to analyze the role that SDIs play in digital government transformation. And we were supposed to do so by looking at the experience of the EU member states plus Norway. So in particular, we had several focus areas. We wanted to look at the institutional setting, which is underpinning SDI and digital government transformation, and see to what extent this institutional setting is common or is separate. We will discuss about governance and strategies in a minute. We wanted to examine the technical infrastructure that has been put in place from the SDI perspective and see its relationship in terms of e-government services, and whether it fostered the reuse and data for public administrations. And then we wanted to look at the usage and benefits of the SDI infrastructure for citizens, businesses, and the public sector itself, but from a digital government transformation perspective. Finally, the scope of this assignment also covered the analysis of the relevance of the OECD recommendation on digital government strategies. We will discuss them later in this presentation, but this recommendation cover aspects of digital government transformation, and our work consisted in checking to what extent these were also applicable to the domain of SDIs, and SDIs were a good practice from the perspective of this OECD recommendation. So to summarize, we had in scope 28 member states plus Norway, and we were really looking for facts and figures on the relation between SDI and digital government transformation. We also wanted to check whether what are the challenges and benefits of SDI's implementation for the digital transformation of government. Just maybe very briefly on what was out of scope. So we have not looked at other countries, so that could be something that could be done in the future, would be very interesting. We didn't look too much into the question of the technical solution developed on top of SDIs, although the technical infrastructure is one part of our framework, as I will present in a few minutes. And also, that's very important, our study did not aim at checking progresses in terms of compliance of Inspire implementation. So the scope was really not to check what member states are doing in that respects, but rather look at the relation between SDI and digital government. Carry out this study and establish and say something meaningful about the relation between SDI and digital government transformation, we came up with a specific analytical framework. So we realized that the existing frameworks were not suitable enough, and we decided to develop a new one that is mirroring the structure of the Open Data Barometers framework, but has different components. And has been developed in an iterative manner. So we originally started with a different framework from what you see now on the slide, and through a number of iterations, we got to this, let's say, the framework that we used in the final study report. I have to add a word of caution here. So we do consider this framework as interesting for many reasons, but it's not a final product as such, in the sense that it can be definitely further improved. And this is the first essay to do something in terms of relation of SDI and digital government transformation. So there are certainly criticisms that can be brought to this framework. Anyhow, so the framework is developed around three key axes or main components. So institutional setting, which includes indicators relating to the governance of SDI and digital government transformation, the strategy underpinning these two, legal framework. We will go into details into each of these aspects later in the presentation. Then we have the technical infrastructure component of the framework, which looks at which includes indicator related to the infrastructure, extended infrastructure, so additional components to the SDI and APIs, interoperability, as well as innovation. And finally, we have a component of the framework which relates to the impact, which basically includes indicators related to the usage of the SDI infrastructure from a digital government transformation perspective, and the benefits of this usage. So what is important to know here is the Open Data Barometers framework is similar in the sense that it looks at readiness, implementation, and impact. So there are some similarities here, but as you see, the indicators have been developed specifically for this assignment, and also the subheading and the components of the framework. What is also important to note here is that you might find in this framework and in some of the indicators, you might find that some of these the aspects covered in this framework relate also to the European interoperability framework. And especially when it comes to organizational and technical interoperability, we have one specific sub-pillar on interoperability, and organizational interoperability can be, it's relevant for the institutional setting indicators. But the purpose was not to have an overlap, and you will see the indicators actually cover aspects that are slightly different from the definition of organizational and technical interoperability, which is included in the EIF. Now that we know how the framework looks like, it's time we move to the methodology that we use to collect data. So we basically did a data collection that was focused on 2 rounds. First, we explored all the 29 countries in scope through interviews and desk researches. And then we did an in-depth analysis of 4 particular countries, which are the Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, and Spain. We use sources coming from both the SDI Inspire community and domain and the e-government digital government domains. And we try to make as much use as possible of existing assessment and evaluation, including the e-government fact sheets, open data maturity index, etc. And as I already mentioned, the framework itself was refined in an agile manner and iterative way. So we started with a number of indicators which were structured in a certain way. Through testing these indicators based on the data collection, we refined the framework a first time and then a second time, and we got to this, let's say, final version between brackets. So the data collection was aiming, yes, to collect facts and figures, but also to test the validity of the framework. And we have also some lessons learned on the framework itself. It is now time we move to the main findings of the study, starting from the institutional setting indicators. And in particular, we can start by discussing what we found in terms of governance of spatial data infrastructure and digital government transformation. So there we focused basically on checking to what extent SDI and digital government transformation are governed by the same bodies and in a coordinated manner. And we saw that countries have very different ways of ensuring coordination and governing these 2 phenomena. In some cases, there are joint decision-making bodies. So bodies which includes a representative from both the SDI community and the digital government communities, and they make decisions on both aspects together. In other cases, there is coordination and there are meetings, for instance, that happens under the umbrella of digitalization agencies, but there is not joint decision as such. What also we saw happening quite often was that there are separate governance bodies, and there are also basically these different governance bodies. They include representative of the 2 different communities. But for instance, if there is a digital government transformation governance body, it will include a few representatives from SDIs and vice versa. Finally, there are some cases in which the coordination is more ad hoc or on a case-by-case basis, need basis. We discussed with a few stakeholders who mentioned that in their countries, the community of people working on this aspect is quite small. So it's also in terms of personal relationship and exchanges that coordination is done. So what came out from this analysis of the governance structure is that there is really a variety of them. This is not to say that one is better than another, but that these 2 phenomena are managed in different ways in different countries, and the decisions are taken in different ways. What we also looked at from the perspective of governance was the level of involvement of other stakeholders in the decision-making process. So other stakeholders, meaning other public sector bodies, which are not directly in charge of SDI or digital government transformation, or universities, NGOs, private sectors, anybody who is external to the government themselves. And there we saw that there is kind of a continuum from going from no involvement whatsoever in the governance of SDI's digital government transformation of external stakeholders, to having them, really in a driving seat, so driving decision, which actually we didn't find we couldn't find examples of, but we find several examples of stakeholder being consulted in the decision taken on SDI and digital government transformation, or stakeholders having specific consultative roles in the governance bodies. In some cases, which is a bit rare but happens, stakeholders might also have some decision-making powers and roles. Here again, we see a variety of situations depending on the countries. In some countries, there is a high level of inclusion of other public bodies, for instance, municipalities and regions. due to the characteristic of the countries, of course. Some countries have very close ties with academia and research organization, and some countries are quite business-oriented. So it's really interesting to see how different public authorities made different choices in terms of inclusion of stakeholder, and we have a menu of examples of how they are included in different ways. So overall, the governance, the analysis of the governance aspects show these varieties of approaches, and the fact that based on their institutional setting and based on path dependency and the history of the country, the decisions are taken in different ways, and the stakeholder included, of course, are also quite different. What we also learned from this, from the analysis of this aspect, is that in some cases, the fact that the SDI community was inclusive of stakeholders brought to reconsider the inclusion of stakeholders in digital government transformation processes, and vice versa. So there was a kind of a cross-fertilization and cross-teaching between these two communities. A second aspect related to institutional setting is the question of strategies related to spatial data infrastructure and digital government transformation. Here, our indicators focused basically on two aspects: whether there was a strategy on these two phenomena together, and how did it look like, and then the question of training and training programs on SDI. So when we look at the strategies, we see that there are basically three main categories of approaches that government took in the countries examined. In some countries, there is one fully dedicated strategy to SDI. And it's really of SDI and its role in digital government transformation. So it's really a more, let's say, inclusive approach in which the two aspects are tackled together, and there is a vision around that. In many countries, probably the majority, the aspect of SDI is included in the digital government strategies and other programming documents. So there, the entry door is the digital government strategy, and SDI is considered in the overall strategy. And finally, there are countries in which SDI is considered as a more technical matter. So there is maybe a dedicated strategy for examining the role of SDI in digital government transformation. Maybe I was not fully clear, but the idea here is to check to what extent these two phenomena are thought together, are considered jointly, or are considered separately, or whether SDI is the entry door for digital government transformation consideration, or vice versa. So we see that in most of the cases, it's the digital government strategies document that include aspects related to SDI. So the SDI is making its way into these more general strategies. This is reflected in terms of training programs, because there are some different approaches again between countries on how to train public officials, but not only to SDIs. There are a few countries which have specific SDI training and capacity building campaigns, really SDI focused. A good example was Poland in the past. They have done very large and effective trainings in the past few years, really focused on SDI. They trained a high number of public officials. Then there are countries in which the training and capacity building activities related to SDI are included in the more general training initiatives concerning digital skills, right? So there, this is basically mirroring a bit the approach of having SDI entering from the door of digital government strategies. So there is no specific training campaign, but there are some activities included in wider programs. And finally, there are some countries in which there are more technical and ad hoc basis forms of training for public officials working on SDI, which are maybe sometimes also more limited in terms of number of people reached, because if it's considered as a technical competence, then there is no reason to do wider scale training programs. So from a strategy point of view, what we learn is that there is quite a number of approaches that seem to work, and the indicator on strategy also kind of indicates which orientation countries have taken in terms of trainings, because if they have one fully dedicated strategy on SDI and digital government transformation, sometimes this also translates in specific training, while if they tackle this matter as a purely technical, then they have a more technical offering of trainings. And finally, for related to the legal frameworks, which is the last components of the technical, of the institutional setting part of our framework. We looked at two aspects. So first of all, we mean legal frameworks on top of INSPIRE. So of course, all the countries in scope have implemented INSPIRE. Then we looked at what happens on top of that from the legislative and policy perspective, which has an influence on SDI and digital government transformation. And there, two things stem out. One is the approach that the different countries have to base registers, and the other is the coordination with the open data policy. So there are countries in which base registers legislation has been developed. It is the case in Flanders. Well, Flanders is not a country, but at the federal level, there is in Flanders a decree on spatial data infrastructure, which basically mandates the use of base registers. So the question of SDI and the use of the parts of the SDI that are related to base registers is mandated by law. This only happens in a limited number of countries, of course. And there are countries in which the use of SDI is not mandated by law as such, but there is a soft approach to promote its use. And Spain, for instance, is quite effective in doing so and in the showing and telling, and showing and telling people the advantage of using SDI within the public sector. It's a show and tell approach, which is not mandatory, of course, but is bearing its fruits, and is increasing then the number of SDIs users within the country. Finally, what we think, but that's of course our hypothesis, is that the focus on and the growing importance of the only once principle will lead to maybe more legislation on the use of SDI in the future, because as you know, now there is more and more focus and attention paid to the fact that citizens should provide their data only once and should not be required by different administrations to provide the same information. And therefore, there will be a need to enhance cross public sector exchange of data, and the use of base registries in particular will be a key way of doing that. But this is just an hypothesis, and it will have to be confirmed. When we look at the coordination with open data policies, on the other hand, well, in Europe, there have been a lot of efforts for aligning SDIs and open data policies, and these are also a proxy for measuring this increase of efforts can be found in the Open Data Maturity Index, which indicates that Europe is quite mature in terms of data policy, which also includes aspects related to SDI. So the fact that SDI and open data policy frameworks are aligning, it's basically a clear advantage from the perspective of digital government transformation, because it means a broader approach to data and data reuse, more alignment in terms of licenses and more awareness about this topic. And therefore, we consider this as a good sign that the question of SDI and data is becoming pivotal for digital government transformation and is recognized as such. So from the legal framework perspective, what we learn is that there are countries in which there is legislation on top of INSPIRE that mandates the use of SDIs. There are countries that are pushing for the use of SDIs within public sector through other means. There is an increasing focus on open once only principle, which also puts the SDIs in a spotlight even more. And then there is increased alignment with open data policies, which is a good indicator of a wider approach to digital government transformation taken by government. Now I give the floor to Glenn for the next slides.
Martina. So as you saw in the framework introduced by Martina, we also have a second block was about infrastructure, technical infrastructure, and also this block consisted of 3 groups of indicators, of which the extended infrastructure, as we call it, was the first part. Extended infrastructure was about the developments of additional components to the SDI beyond traditional SDIs or beyond SDIs as defined by INSPIRE. And there we found to begin that several countries, or quite a lot of countries, have been working, especially recently, on developing additional components, additional aspects beyond, I think we should definitely say beyond traditional SDI. beyond Inspire is no longer correct, because we see that Inspire is also addressing more and more some of these components. So it's about web processing services, gazetteer services, sensor services, invoke services. Just some example of additional services beyond traditional SDIs. I think what is important to be aware of here is that many of these components or services, they are all aimed at a better integration, better uptake of spatial data in the context of digital government processes, digital government services. So you see that work has been done on the technical side to support the uptake of spatial data and to make sure that the spatial data can contribute to digital government transformation. Very important in that context was the adoption of a more user-centric approach. Just one example that, or just some illustration that we see in several countries, is that they no longer focus on making as much as possible different services available, but they think more and more on how can we really improve the quality of our services, or how can we make sure that we develop services that are actually usable, valuable for our users. In that context, but also in the next slide I will mention this, you see more and more there's a tendency to move towards platforms, so no longer portals making data available, but really trying to implement the idea of a digital platform in the context of SDIs. So what I was saying about those different components, that especially, or that also applies to the development of APIs, APIs that should allow to, or that should contribute to making SDIs more user-centric, but also to make sure that spatial data are more and more can be taken up by the geospatial community and by developers. So also that aspect we addressed in our study, or in our exploratory study. We didn't really look only at the development of APIs, but we also looked at how our governments, how our different countries dealing with policies, initiatives to steer, to facilitate, to enable both development and uptake of these APIs, which become more and more relevant. And then you see there some examples in different countries of different kind of actions, initiatives taken by member states. So it's about creating catalogs of APIs, it's about developing or putting into place particular portals for APIs. Also strategies, for instance, the Netherlands, they have developed a national strategy on API. That's also an example of a way government initiative, or not only government, but initiative on how to steer, facilitate the development of APIs. I think an example not mentioned here, and what we also see more and more in several countries, is the organization of competitions for, or awards for awarding the best API in a certain country. So you see many different initiatives through which one aims to coordinate, facilitate development, uptake of APIs. So these are the two indicators or aspects we considered as relevant under the extended infrastructure part of our framework. On the next slide, we will see the second group of indicators for concerns our technical infrastructure. The second group was mainly about interoperability, and more in particular particular and technical interoperability, which we not only see as essential for an SDI, but especially essential and also very important if you want to make the link between SDI and e-government or digital government. So what concerns the data part, we saw some interesting good practices, even best practices, in again going beyond semantic interoperability as requested by Inspire or by traditional SDIs. One practice I think is mentioned to Israel is good to mention here is about the collaboration of across administrative levels that really work together on rethinking their data collection flows and trying to integrate it. So you have an overall government strategy on how a certain data set should be established, in which different actors, and mainly government actors at different levels, contribute by adding a particular part of or a particular data set. Another thing mentioned here, more and more relevant, more and more countries are taking initiatives in that domain, is about the harmonization of spatial and non-spatial data. So So here we mentioned the example of Germany, but also in the Netherlands, you see more and more recent initiatives that are thinking on not only harmonization of spatial data on itself, but also thinking on how can we work on the harmonization of spatial and administrative data, which still is a challenge. I think those are two aspects that are relevant about the semantic interoperability. In addition to that, we also had a look at how countries are working on using and developing catalogs, but also portals to make their data discoverable and in the end also accessible. One initiative that you see more and more, or one phenomenon that you see more and more in different countries, is about thinking on how can we link, how can we integrate geocatalogs with the more overall open data catalogs. You see many countries have been investigating that, trying to look for what is the best approach, not only technically, but also organizationally on how can we ensure that. So that was one observation or one key development we saw in many countries, which was strongly also related to that was about the exchange of metadata between portals. So again, it's about an overall strategy on how can we make sure that data are made discoverable, accessible through different portals. Often many of these portals have their own perspective, but it's about avoiding duplication, avoiding contradictions, to make sure that there's really a well-aligned overall approach on creating portals and also catalogs. And I think in this context, it's especially relevant to see in some countries, they are thinking on how can we move away not only from those traditional portals, but how can we move more and more towards digital platforms, which not only focus on making data available, making data discoverable, but also look on more active ways of collaboration, discussions, involvement of many different actors. So not only the government actors, not only the producers of data, but you see more and more there are different kinds of interactions, supported interaction between government and different kinds of non-government actors. I think here you see, although it's still a concept that really needs to be defined in the context of SDIs, but you see that those kind of digital platforms, or at least the idea of establishing digital platforms, you see more and more countries are trying to implement that in the context of SDIs. And then a third set or a third group of indicators on the technical infrastructure was all about innovation, in which we had a look at two particular aspects. The first aspect was the reuse, the integration of more generic ICT solutions in the context of SDIs. And there we focused in particular on the developments of solutions, components developed under the ISA and the programs or of the European Commission. We found a few examples of countries that are at least aware of those components, ISA and ISA Square components, or these solutions. Some of them are starting to explore it or thinking how can we integrate it. Some of them already have implemented them. You see some examples about, for instance, the core vocabularies. You see, and some countries are more advanced in that. Now, in general, it's relatively low, and I think that's something we should think on how can we maybe try to, as a commission, but also under the context of the ELISE knowledge transfer project, how can we at least try to increase the awareness on these kind of generic ICT solutions, and how can we try to help support stakeholders in integrating these more generic ICT solutions in the context of the SDI. Because we think that's one way or one aspect relevant to SDIs and their role in digital transformation. Now, in addition to that, this more specific indicator, we had also a more overall indicator where we try to investigate or collect information on how countries are been dealing with the issue of innovation in the context of SDIs. So how do they deal with recognizing new developments, new trends, new technologies, experimenting with them, testing them, and in the end to make sure that they can be integrated if considered to be valuable. To be honest, not many countries have a real, should I say, strategic approach or a strong structured approach, as we call it on the slides, on doing that. So implementing some kind of the technology trends watch and then afterwards testing them in the context of pilots, testbeds. We found some countries that are doing them. Again, Netherlands, I think, is one of the good countries that have done a lot of interesting things in this domain. But to be honest, so far it's only a minority of countries that have some kind of more structured approach. You see it's more and more ad hoc approaches are applied. One particular mechanism that that we detected in several countries, several member states, was the use of research projects and also the collaboration with universities and research centers and also private companies in the context of, for instance, the Horizon 2020 program. See, in the context of those kind of projects, see countries are working on testing new solutions, thinking about and collaborating with other stakeholders on that. But I think in general, you see a lot of more and more, it's really the users that determine. So if there's a particular user need, a user requirements that is relevant for an SDI, that will be used by countries to investigate, what does it mean now in terms of new technological requirements. You see the more and more countries that are especially focusing on the needs, requirements of their users, rather than on implementing, testing the technological solutions on its own. I think that's the summary of this part of the framework. So, and then as introduced in the, again in the framework, as it was introduced by Martina, we had a third main component or main dimension or axis in our framework, which was all about the impact. So the impact of SDIs in the context of digital government transformation, where we identified two main indicators. One, the first indicator was on the usage of SDIs, not only by the public sector, but also outside the public sector, companies, but also by citizens. We collected some qualitative, or some countries collected some qualitative information on that, which shows that the usage really significantly increased in the past years. So more and more data are used by a growing number of users. So you see in the public sector itself, SDIs are really used to improve processes and also to improve delivery of services to citizens. While on the other hand, you see it's not only the use of SDI data services is no longer restricted on government agencies, government departments, but you see also the private sector is now building, creating new projects, new services on top of the SDIs. You see many of these services are really useful for citizens. So one example is about an application. I think that's an interesting application. An applications for bikers and hikers, which was developed not by a government company and not by a government agency, but it was developed on top of the data provided by a government. I think these kind of examples, we only mentioned here a few, or we only mentioned here an overall summary, but I think these kind of examples are really valuable to show how SDIs, or how at least the use of SDI data and services can contribute to digital government transformation. So we summarized these into three main aspects. So one was on to what extent member state itself, do they already monitor the extent to which their data services are used and for which purposes, by who. There we saw two main approaches. One was the more quantitative approach, where user statistics, downloads, etc. were used to get some insight on who is using what data, etc. And in some countries try to also develop some more specific in-depth case studies. So not only the quantitative information, but also on how data are used, for which purposes, by who, etc. So they're really more development of stories that really show how spatial data, the use of spatial data and services, contribute to transformation of government. In general, but that's not always the case. We see that in many cases where there is many evidence available on the use by the public sector, I think also in that countries there are also a lot of information was available on the use by private sector and other kind of users. So you see some countries that have developed an approach on measuring, collecting information on usage of their data. They're often doing it not only for public sector on its own, but also have a look at the overall picture, also including use of data by non-government agencies. Something we had difficulties to detect, also we found a few examples, but something we think is still extremely relevant was the use of SDI data services in the context of cross-border online public services. So we did some effort to try to identify initiatives, practices dealing with cross-border initiatives and practices, but we saw that many of them were focusing mainly on setting up an SDI, so making data available, while we think that also in the context of cross-border public services, but also cross-border decision-making processes, I think there we see SDIs, and especially Inspire, can have a huge contribution to, again, transformation of government. Now, just to show you one example as an illustration, we found an illustration, but one example on was the X-Road initiative, or the X-Road data exchange, a cross-border initiative in Estonia, in Finland, focusing on the exchange of road data and related data. So there was the aim was to make the life of travelers in that region, to improve it or to make it easier, more effective, by combining and by sharing different types of data exchange. So here you just see the different types of data that are exchanged, but not exchanged for the purpose of exchanging data, but really for providing a certain service or at least improving the life of their citizens. And in that context, it's about travelers. I think this examples also shows that there are, this example shows that there are opportunities for further developments. So originally the focus is on exchange of road data, but you can imagine that in later stages, this can be interesting for many additional new developments. For instance, emergency services, they can further build upon this initiative, energy efficiency. I think you can think about a lot of further developments, building further on this original focus on cross-border exchange of road data. Just some kind of illustration of what we found, but just some kind of thing on this is what we are really interested in to find more about. And in the context of ELISE, we will probably do some additional effort on really detecting these cross-border initiatives. So not cross-border setting up of SDIs, but really cross-border delivery of services supported by those SDIs. And then the final set of indicators was all about the actual benefits of SDIs, but not only of the SDIs on its own, but the benefits of integrating SDIs in the context of digital government and digital government transformation. In this part of the studies, we were able to identify benefits, not only not only for public sector organizations, but again, we also see more and more benefits for businesses, but also citizens. Now here we group them into 5 main categories. Now you see it's not always distinguish between benefits of an SDI or benefits of integrating an SDI in a digital context. We identified them or categorized them into 5 main groups. One was all about efficiency, optimization of processing, more and more cooperation and exchange between stakeholders. So again, not only cooperation on the data exchange, but also cooperation in the process on service deliveries. Better policy outcomes was a more public sector based benefit. We also were able to identify, and finally innovation, so rethinking processes, developing new processes, and especially developing new services. So we just added a few examples here. I'm not going to mention them all. I think overall a key observation that we see, that you see more and more, and I think that's related to SDI in the context of digital government transformation. You see it's not only about benefits of one single organization, but you see it's more and more about realizing benefits for many multiple organizations, multiple stakeholders, in the sense that you try to realize benefits for all involved stakeholders. I think that's a very relevant development we were able to identify here. Okay, let me now just say a few more slides. So I hope we can have some time for discussion. So just a few more slides on our key conclusions about government information. In one of the previous webinars in the context of this webinar series of rapid studies, we introduced a working definition of digital government transformation by Zhang and colleagues. They stated the fundamental digital government transformation is about fundamental changes in the way how public organizations are structured, how they operate, how they deliver public services, develop policies and implement and evaluate these policies, but also how citizens are engaged in democratic processes. And it's all about the resulting from the introduction of technologies. Now, without going too much into detail on this, I think a lot of this we have found evidence, and we included benefits on a lot of these aspects in our studies. Just small changes. In our eyes, it's not only about fundamental changes. We saw a lot of incremental changes. So governments that have been incrementally, how should I say, improving the role, the contribution of SDIs in digital government transformation. So it's not about a fundamental view or action on digital transformation, but it's rather about developing new components, new policies, new strategies, further developing the legal framework, the government structure, all with the aim of improving the transformation of government. So I think it's important, not only from our experiences on SDIs in Europe, it's not only about fundamental one-time changes, but we see clearly also a lot of incremental changes that in the end had a lot of quite enormous impact on digital government transformation. We clearly saw an evolution on the relationship between actors. So it's no longer a government policy or a government initiatives, but you see more and more actions, initiatives, policies, etc., that try to involve also non-government stakeholders and try to promote also the co-design of services, co-design of policies. So also for that we were able to find evidence. To add on that, Zhang, they particularly talk about the introduction of technologies. In our study, in our framework, we also addressed how those technologies were improved, were further adapted. So we don't consider it as implementing or introducing technologies to change. We try to express more strongly the interplay between technological and non-technological components, in the sense that it's not only about introducing technologies, but also about how can we improve those kinds of technologies and how can we ensure the adoption of them, again, by as much as possible stakeholders. And I think the key conclusion from our study, I think that's what we aimed to demonstrate with our study, is that SDIs, the potential of SDIs for changing the way policies are developed and changing the way the services are delivered, is huge. I think we already have realized to a certain extent quite a lot of that potential, but I think there's still a lot of progress that can be made with regard to that. And then finally, also an aspect that was included in the study, and also another perspective to look at digital government strategy, where we looked on one of the main policy or government initiatives on digital government transformation. It's about the OECD work, and in particular the OECD recommendation on digital government strategies, which 12 principles were identified that should support or that can be or considered as relevant in the concept of digital transformation. Now, we use these 12 principles in our studies to explore and to map and also demonstrate the current role of SDIs inspired in Europe in the context of digital government transformation. So in this slide, I present you the 12 components. Now, based on the analysis we made, I'm not going to explain our underlying study, so that's probably something that you can read in the report, but I just want to show you our approach. So we used these 12 principles to clearly show, in our opinion, and based on the study we've done, based on the developments that took place in Europe, we showed the current contribution, the current role SDIs inspire in Europe play in digital government transformation, in which we were able to, in our opinion again, this is our view on it, to identify some fields where we think that SDIs in Europe already had a huge contribution in digital government transformation. I think we clearly see a data-driven culture in the public sector on spatial data. I think that's really developed throughout the years. We now have a very strong data-driven culture, also a more coherent use on how to deal with spatial data and spatial technologies, very relevant. Organization and governance frameworks, also here SDIs framework, SDIs inspire, they were very successful in. And also the international cooperation across countries, but also between member states and the European Commission. I think that's really good examples of how SDIs in Europe have contributed to digital government transformation. And then in addition to these fields where we already identified a very strong or a very high impact, we also identified some fields where further improvements could be. But again, if you're interested to read the details about this analysis, I would say please read the report and let us know your thoughts on this. Okay, now the key takeaways, just 1 minute to very summarize the main elements or the main conclusions of our study. So as we developed in the beginning, we have developed a very particular analytical framework. We're not saying that this is the best framework, but the framework was rather a first attempt to show or to collect evidence on the role of SDIs in the context of digital transformation, reusing a lot of information data that was collected through other frameworks, but also collecting new relevant practices information, all to show, demonstrate, provide evidence on how SDIs can play and already play a huge role in digital government transformation. A lot of evidence that in the context of SDIs in Europe, that they already play a key role in digital government transformation. One thing it already Martina in the context of the governance approach, but I think this applies to all of it. So we really saw that's not one single best practices that all countries should adopt, but rather there's a diversity of many different successful approaches amongst the countries. Some of them, for instance, more focused on the government's non-technological parts. Other ones in other countries, you see there's more tendency to focus for technical infrastructures. Again, I think we didn't talk a lot about, or we didn't want to see the evidence in our countries as really single best practices, but rather demonstrations of many different approaches adopted in different European countries, all with the aim of improving the role or strengthening the role of SDIs in digital government. Now, one thing that we found interesting, or one thing we found relevant for a further study, was everything about the real impact and the benefits of SDIs in the context of digital government transformation. So the third part of our study, the impact part, we think that's something we really should focus on in the next years, and if possible, more and more also try to collect qualitative data on that. Because we see many countries are having difficulties on that, to really collect quantitative data that help them to demonstrate that SDIs already have a strong impact in digital government transformation. One thing that's relevant here is about awareness raising, but also skills development. No, maybe we can. Yeah, okay, sorry, Robin, just go ahead. I think the next slide is about the discussion or the questions for discussion, but I think this is the part where you will take over.
Sorry, Glenn, were you?
Robin, would you like to say something? Okay, sorry.
Glenn, were you handing back to me?
Yes, I think I suggest that that we use these questions, that you introduce them, not only in the context of this study, but also explain the link with our ELISE knowledge transfer.
Yes.
Uh,
Sorry, thanks for that. Just at the very end of your presentation, I think at least I wasn't able to pick you up. So thanks for that for now, and I'll make a few closing statements as well myself. So to enable our discussion that we'll have when we stop the recording, we'd already like to share with you some ideas. So what we've been doing in the rapid studies is trying to put some shape around the topics, and clearly the work of Vanda and colleagues here, Glenn and Martina in particular, has tried to give some particular shape to that in the context of SDI. So some of our discussion questions, therefore, about which aspects you think, having heard the presentation today, of geospatial data, geospatial technologies, and what we call geospatial thinking, our typical way of doing things, of exchanging and using geospatial data, and also the skills that Glenn mentioned. Which of these do you think contribute potentially most to the digital transformation of government? What's the unique selling point of our geospatial world in this context? And also, can you give us any examples of cross-border projects or operational activities that are making use of geospatial or thinking in support of the digital transformation of government? We had the X-Road Estonia-Finnish example, but we'd really like to hear about others. And thirdly, as I've already mentioned, this is a way of approaching topics in quite an open process and sharing them with you. And so it's another opportunity to hear from you today if there's anything that really struck you that's worth us going into more detail. Of course, as mentioned before, the final report of the study will be published soon, and we'll keep you all informed, those that have registered, first of all, for this event, to let you know when it goes live. Next slide. So just to let you know, there's a series of references, of course, related to this work, but I'd like to give a few closing comments as well, because I think there's quite a lot that's been covered here. So in the first instance, I want to thank both Glenn and Martina for their presentation. Also, I would like to thank Vanda for her key work in shaping this topic, and we're really looking forward to developing a number of the directions that have been presented. And there's also been, I know, an appreciation of this work by others in the European Commission. So for me, this study has been more than just a starting point, as Glenn and Martina have outlined. In the first instance, I think you have covered a lot of work, and as I mentioned at the beginning, Gianluca and colleagues are looking into developing a specific framework in this context, but I think it's interesting to look at the overall topic of digital government specifically from this geospatial, and in this case, spatial data infrastructure perspective. So again, for me, many elements are clearly quite mature, but there is indeed a need for further exploration in key aspects. So as highlighted by Glenn, this first attempt to try and apply some weighting or sense around the OECD framework is a good example for something that needs wider debate. What I also appreciated in this work, that it starts to offer some shape to the overall topic that we're dealing with in this series of studies, where you've made, for example, reference to elements of some of our previous studies, including the continuum of power relations a la Castel, harking back to the last presentation from Therese on citizen science and digital participation. These are aspects that we need to consider, I think, overall in terms of this topic, but also technical aspects that you highlighted, such as the previous rapid study in a lot of detail on APIs. Indeed, I've been explaining some aspects of digital transformation to colleagues in terms of a rewiring of data sharing and its processes. And what I really appreciate with this study is you're actually bringing to the fore concrete examples that I think are very helpful to show that these ideas are not only theoretical ones, but are practical and can be identified and realized in real-world cases, arguably with all the benefits and complexity for further investigation that offers. And I also think you clearly outlined a different approach to the typical evaluation of SDIs. This is something that we've been doing for a long time as a unit, especially in our progress towards setting up the Inspire Directive, its monitoring, and of course will in the future have the evaluation of the directive. So we have the chance, I think, to position familiar work for many of us working in the SDI context within this new topic of digital transformation. The fundamental changes and also incremental changes, as you've helpfully highlighted, on how public sector organizations are not only working together, but I think importantly with others, including the cooperation collaboration perspective you've highlighted with businesses and citizens, as well as the partnerships that you all could really clearly identify with research community. It also clearly has links with policy development and the, let's say, increased use of geospatial data in online services, which also I think links then to the interest that we have in the knowledge transfer project as a whole about digital skills and the geospatial literacy as one example. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've used this meeting to explain some of the findings from the report that Vanda and you have developed, and we'll share that with you shortly. But we'd also like to continue the meeting with a short discussion on your thoughts on what you've heard today and to have some inputs for possible avenues for exploration. And just to let you know, as I've done in previous occasions, the kind of topics we're already considering is maybe to look into, for example, local data sharing issues around digital innovation hubs that have been also a topic that we're interested in to try and disseminate some of our results, but also to explore the role of geospatial in topics like gamification and serious games, continuing some of the discussion from the Citizen Science and Digital Participation Rapid Study, potentially to explore some of the dynamics of interorganizational collaboration in a more practical and deep way. So, many thanks for the work that you've been doing on this already, and I'm now going to stop the recording and allow everybody